Welcome to our Shiur, Rambam on the Perasha. This week we will read Parshat Shelach Lecha Nashim. And the truth of the matter is, there were two strong candidates for topics this week. Two of my favorite topics to present Rambam's views on. One is Israel and Rambam's views on the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The other is visiting cemeteries and praying to the dead. I chose Eretz Yisrael because I already wrote an article on cemeteries and praying to the dead, which was published in a volume called Rav Shalom Banaich, in honor of my teacher and mentor, Rabbi Shalom Karmi. I wrote that article with my son, Amichai. It is unclear who sends the spies into the land of Israel to scout out the land. What we do know is that the Jewish people are getting ready to march forward to the promised land, to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael in order to inhabit the land of Israel. Everyone wants to know Rambam's views on Eretz Yisrael. In fact, everyone believes their views on Israel are Rambam's views. The saintly, anti-Zionist and anti-Yishuv Eretz Yisrael Rabbi of Satmar, in his Teshuvot Vayoel Moshe, quotes passages of Rambam to prove his anti-Yishuv Eretz Yisrael views. We're not going to go there. To begin understanding the importance and significance of Rambam and the Rambam placed on living in Eretz Yisrael, let us see what he writes in the Mishneh Torah on the subject. I hope you will take notice of how Rambam says what he says, the emotion and the sense of longing in his words. I want to read to you from Hilchot Melachim, chapter 5, Halachot Yod and Yud Aleph. Rambam says as follows: Gedolei HaChachamim hayu menashekim al tchumei Eretz Yisrael. The great sages would kiss the borders of Israel. Umenashekim avaneha, they would kiss her stones. Umitgalgelin al afara, and they would roll in her dirt. Amru Chachamim, kol hashochein be'eretz Yisrael avonotav mechulin. The Chachamim taught, whomever lives in the land of Israel, his or her sins are completely forgiven. Afilu halach ba'arba amot, even if you walk 4 amot, 4 handbreadths in the land of Israel, you merit the world to come. V'chein hakavur ba nitkaper lo. One who's buried in the land of Israel, his sins are forgiven. Ukeilu hamakom shehu bo mizbach kapara, as if the very land of Israel is the mizbeach, is the altar of atonement. Ve'eino domeh kol tato mechayim lekol tato achar moto. But one cannot compare, says the Rambam, one who comes to the land of Israel while alive to the one who comes to the land of Israel after death. Ve'af al pi kein, but nevertheless, gdolei hachachamim hayu molichim meitehem lesham. The great sages would bring their deceased to be buried in the land of Israel. Tzei ulmad me Yaakov Avinu ve Yosef HaTzadik. We should learn from Yaakov Avinu and from Yosef. Even after reading these passages, believe it or not, there are those who doubt the importance Rambam places on Israel. A popular question that is asked on Rambam is why he does not list Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 mitzvot. Ramban Nachmanides does, and argues that Rambam here overlooked an important mitzvah. I, for one, have never been bothered by this omission. When I was young, I wrote an article explaining why Rambam does not include Teshuvah as one of the 613 mitzvot. Does this mean Teshuvah is not important to Rambam? Of course not. We don't have to go far to be convinced that Rambam placed great importance on Eretz Yisrael and living in Eretz Yisrael. I read to you Halacha Yud Bet from the same chapter in Hilchot Melachim. Le'olam yadur adam be'eretz Yisrael afilu be'ir sheruba goyim. One should always choose to live in the land of Israel, even in a city where the majority of its inhabitants are non-Jews. Ve'al yadur bechutz la'aretz va'afilu be'ir sheruba Yisrael. And one should not live outside the land of Israel, even in a city where the majority are Jews. Rabbi Dr. Isidore Twersky, one of the great, if not the greatest Maimonidean to have lived in the last 100 years, wrote an article titled Maimonides and Eretz Yisrael, Halachic, Philosophic, and Historical Perspectives. In this article, Rabbi Twersky shows how Rambam artistically, even poetically, restores Israel and Israel consciousness to the Jewish people through the Mishneh Torah. Not directly or in your face sort of way, but rather subliminally, in a most natural and holistic fashion. In this beautiful article, Dr. Twersky exposes Rambam's style at its best, most magnificent. One takes note not only of what Rambam says and what he does not say, but also how he says what he says and the meaning imputed in all the omissions. Rabbi Twersky wrote the seminal work on the Mishneh Torah, and he notes how the comprehensive nature of the Mishneh Torah's codification is in itself the work's greatest innovation. For Rambam, the oral law is one organic, invisible whole. By weaving into a single fabric the laws that deal with Beit HaMikdash, sacrifices, Sanhedrin, Shemitah, and Yovel, alongside Shabbat, Yom Tov, Brachot, and Yesodei Torah, Rambam creates an awareness of the subjects that require Eretz Yisrael and places them on the consciousness of the Jew. One studies the laws of the Beit HaMikdash alongside the laws of Shabbat. The laws of sacrifices that can only be brought in Jerusalem are woven into the laws of Pesach and all the other Moadim. The organic whole implicit in the presentation is the idea that the very system of law requires a nation in an autonomous state, a land of its own, governed by their own people. The very system and structure is not meant for a jury in the diaspora. This is a legal code whose ultimate expression is fully realized within a political entity. I've said this in the past and I'll say it again. Rambam wrote to the rabbis of Lunel and asked them, how could there be a nation without a code of law? The entire enterprise, the entire project of Judaism requires a land, a state, autonomy, a capital. So from a suprastructural perspective, Israel is implicit in all of Rambam's writings. Rambam's genius lies within the presentation itself. How he incorporates Israel into the halacha in a natural and seamless fashion. Take, for example, Hilchot Nesiat Kapayim in Sefer Ahava. Rambam writes as follows regarding Birkat Kohanim. Bamikdash mevarchin Birkat Kohanim pam achat bayom. In the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohanim would do their bracha once a day. Achar tamid shel shachar. After bringing the sacrifice of the tamid. Ba'in ve'omdin al ma'alot ha'olam u'mevarchim kederech shamarnu. They would come and stand on the stairs in the hallway and bless the people. In Hilchot Pesachim, Rambam does a similar thing. Rambam says as follows in Hilchot Pesachim, chapter 7, Halacha Yud Bet. Achilat maror einam mitzvah min haTorah bifnei atzma. The eating of the maror is not in itself a mitzvah deoraita. Ela teluya hi b'achilat haPesach shemitzvat aseh echat. Rather, it's completely dependent on the eating of the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice that was brought in the Beit HaMikdash, in Jerusalem, in Israel. This is what makes up mitzvah achat, the one mitzvah. Le'echol besar Pesach al matzah umrorim. The mitzvah is Pesach with the matzah umrorim. No other codifier of Hilchot Pesach or Hilchot Nesiat Kapayim bothers to teach us that there's a larger context to these mitzvot. And that context is Eretz Yisrael, a Beit HaMikdash, Korbanot, and Jerusalem. I just gave you two examples of countless such examples throughout the Mishneh Torah. Rambam in Igeret Teiman makes a very powerful claim. The Jewish people's spiritual, religious, and intellectual setbacks are all a result of not being in our own land, exercising our own autonomy and self-governance. The destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, he argues, led to beliefs of superstition, magic, astrology, and necromancy. And yet, the dispersion of the Jews from their land, says Rambam, is much more tragic than even the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Let me read to you from Hilchot Ta'aniyot. And we're going to learn a little piece of study to see how Rambam's genius, how he interprets the Talmud in his methodology. Rambam writes as follows. Yom Shelishi B'Tishrei Shebo Nehera Gedalia ben Achikam. On the third day of Tishrei, the day that Gedalia ben Achikam was killed, murdered, V'nichbat Gachelet Israel, and the ember, the spark of Israel was extinguished. V'sibeib lehatem galutam, and this is what led to the dispersion, to the exile of the Jews from the land. The last ember, the last spark of fire in the land of Israel. If one does not know the Gemara, you think Rambam is simply copy and pasting, but he's not. The Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah says nothing of Gachelet Israel. The Gemara speaks of the death of a tzaddik. Rambam here introduces the element of losing the land of Israel. Gachelet Israel, the last ember, the last spark of the land. Notice how Rambam subliminally puts Israel at the center of Tzom Gedalia. Permit me. One more source in this regard. I gave an entire shiur on this last week. The renewal of Semicha and the Sanhedrin. And I noted how, for Rambam, that is dependent on the land of Israel. I read to you from Hilchot Sanhedrin. Rambam says as follows. Nirin li hadvarim, it appears to me, Rambam says, she'im hiskimu kol hachachamim shebe'eretz Israel. If all the sages in the land of Israel agreed, lemanot dayanim velismoch otam, to appoint judges and to give them semicha, harei elu semuchim v'yesh lahem ladun. They are considered sages with semicha that links them to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, the dispersion of the people outside the land of Israel is a decisive historical factor for Rambam. Again, we notice how Israel, Eretz Israel, is at the center of the renewal of Semicha and the establishment of the Sanhedrin. So I, for one, don't make a big deal about the fact that Yishuv Eretz Israel is not listed in Sefer HamItzvoth, because it is such an overwhelming, all-encompassing mitzvah like Teshuvah, it cannot be listed as a single mitzvah. But I believe, and I think I've shown there's enough evidence in the Mishneh Torah to suggest that for Rambam, the Jewish people are significantly impoverished by not living in the land of Israel. How about Kedushat Eretz Israel? We made a case for the supreme value Rambam places on Eretz Israel. But how about the nature of the land? Its Kedusha, its sanctity. The Gemara in Masechet Megillah and Yevamot speak of two Kedushot, the first temporal and the second lasting. Rabbeinu Hananel, an early 11th century Rishon, and I would argue most other Rishonim, early and later medieval commentaries believe, the Gemara is referring to the Avot, who sanctified the land temporarily. They were Kedusha Rishona, while Yoshua bin Nun and the Jews who came with Yehoshua sanctified it a second time for good. Kicham le'atid lavo. This position is very nice. Yehoshua was a prophet guided by Hashem. The generation that witnessed the exodus from Egypt, Kiryat Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. So it makes sense that his sanctification of the land is the sanctification that is lasting, that is forever. That is not the position of Rambam. I'm going to read to you from Hilchot Terumah of the Rambam, and I'm going to read to you his position. Rambam says as follows: Kol she'echziku olei Mitzrayim nitkadesh kedusha rishona. Yehoshua and the Jewish people that came out of Egypt and settled the land of Israel, that was Kedusha Rishona, the first sanctification of the land. Kevan shegalu batla kedushatan. The moment that they were exiled from the land, the sanctity of the land was exiled with them, disappeared. Shekedusha Rishona lefi shehaita mipnei hakibush bilvad kitcha l'sha'ata v'lo kitcha l'atid lavo. Rambam says here, that Kedusha of Yehoshua and the people that came from Egypt was sanctified because of kibush, conquering the land. Therefore, kitcha l'sha'ata, it was only sanctified for that time and not for future generations. Kevan she'alu b'nei hagula, but when the Jews returned back from Bavel, b'nei hagula, Ezra, and the people of Shivat Tzion, ve'cheziku b'miktzat haaretz, and they took hold of the land, kitshua kedusha shniya, it was sanctified for a second time, ha'omedet le'olam, l'sha'ata v'la'atid lavo. A sanctity that was at that time and for future generations. For Rambam, the first Kedusha was established by Yehoshua. That Kedusha expired when the Jewish people were exiled. The second Kedusha was established by Ezra and Shivat Zion during the reign of the Persian Empire. The problem with this position is, what gave Ezra and those that returned to Israel with him the spiritual power to make their Kedusha an everlasting one? If anything, one would argue their Kedusha is inferior. Ezra was not a Navi, a prophet. And the people that came with Ezra were ragtag. They were ignorance. Here we see Rambam's genius and political savvy. Rambam distinguishes, if you noticed, between kivush and chazakah. Kivush is conquering the land. Yehoshua conquered the land from the Canaanites. Ezra acquired it politically. For Rambam, the political acquisition is more powerful and more lasting than military conquest. Beautiful, unbelievable. How about Jerusalem? The Gemara tells us Yerushalayim was made holy by Melech Shlomo, King Solomon, and remained so forever. Rambam explains why Jerusalem is different. In Hilchot Beit HaBechira, Rambam tells us as follows. I'm reading from chapter 6, Halacha 16, in Hilchot Beit HaBechira. Ve'lama ani omer b'mikdash ve'Yerushalayim kedusha rishonat kitcha le'atid lavo. Why do I say, says the Rambam, that with regards to the Mikdash and Yerushalayim, the first sanctification is the sanctification that lasted forever? ובקדושת שאר ארץ ישראל עניין שביעית ומעשרות הקצה בהן לא קידשה לעתיד לבוא. But with regards to the rest of the land of Israel, as we said earlier, the first kedusha was only temporal. לפי שקדושת המקדש וירושלים מפני השכינה. Because when it comes to Jerusalem and the Mikdash, that was sanctified because of the Shekhinah. Ushekhinah eina betela. And Shekhinah is never extinguished. The Shekhinah is what gave Jerusalem her eternal sanctity. Rambam explains in his Moreh Nevuchim, section 3, chapter 45, why it is that Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Torah. He gives 3 reasons. 1, to deter the nations of the world from controlling it. 2, to deter the nations of the world from destroying it. And 3, to ensure the tribes of Israel not fight over that portion of the land. I want to explain further Rambam's understanding of the Kedusha of Ezra HaSofer and the Jews of Shivat Zion in the context of the Kedusha of Shlomo HaMelech and Jerusalem. Unlike the Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Levy or the Kabbalah or Hasidic thought, for Rambam, Kedusha, holiness, is something the human being has the power to create. According to Rambam, Kedusha is initiated, is infused on an object, or in this case, the land of Israel, by people and by intention. Kavanat Halev. I want to read to you a beautiful passage at the end of Hilchot Mikvaot, the laws that deal with making a mikveh. Rambam, the last halacha, notes how all these laws of tumah and tahara, cleanliness, purity and impurity, are chukim. These are laws that we really can't understand. Gzeirat hakatuv hi. It's a gzeirat hakatuv. Ve'adavar talui bekavanat halev. And it all depends on kavanat halev, the intention of the heart. Ulefikach amru chachamim taval velo huchzak. If someone immerses himself in the mikveh or herself in the mikveh, but has no intention, ke'ilu lo taval, it's worth nothing. You've accomplished nothing. Ve'af apikein remez yesh badavar, keshem she'amekavein libo letaher, kevan shetaval tahor, af al pi shelo nitchadesh begufo davar. Rambam says that one who has the intention of purifying, of purification, and dips into the water, you change nothing. The purification takes place. It is the intention of the individual. The desire is what makes tahara and Kedusha. Jerusalem is kadosh forever and infinitely because of our strong desire for the Shekhinah. David HaMelech and the people of Israel wanted Jerusalem in order to build the Beit HaMikdash and bring Hashem's Shekhinah to the earth. Mizmor Shechanukat Habayit LeDavid. The Beit HaMikdash is always referred to King David's Beit HaMikdash because he desired it. He wanted it. Similarly, the generation of Ezra sanctified Israel because of their strong desire to settle the land and make it their own. They left Bavel, their comforts, to fulfill the promise of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, of Shivat Zion. Our conclusions, my friends, about Rambam's views on Eretz Yisrael will always be complicated because of his own life choices. Unlike Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and Ramban, who traveled to Israel and died there, Rambam traveled to Israel but could not stay there. I believe this too is part of Rambam's greatness. He did not amend or qualify the halakha to justify his choices. It is clear to anyone who reads Rambam honestly that Israel and settling the land of Israel are of great religious and spiritual importance. And the desire we bring to that mitzvah of settling the land of Israel is what gives the land its everlasting Kedusha. That's what gave Jerusalem its everlasting Kedusha, the desire to bring the Shekhinah down. That's what gave Ezra and the people of Shivat Zion the power to give the land of Israel an everlasting Kedusha. Kavanat Halev, the desire of their heart. I hope we made a strong case for Rambam and the importance the land of Israel plays in Rambam's thought, thinking, halakha, and philosophy. Thank you for your attention.